Okay.
Hello, and welcome to Synchronicity for your mind, body, and your soul. I'm Marie, and we're joined again by TJ Woodward. TJ is the author of Conscious Recovery and several other books. He was on last week, and we were so excited by our conversation that we immediately booked another one to continue this because he trains clinicians and rehab facilities in the conscious recovery method. And that work is so important in creating a better world for all of us. So we wanted to continue the conversation. Welcome back to the show, TJ.
Oh, thank you, Marie. I had so much fun with you last week. So this is going to be an absolute joy. And, I love the work you're doing. And I loved our conversation last week. So here we go.
Yay. Thank you so much. So I actually was looking at your book, and a couple of things stood out for me that I felt really resonated with me was this idea that if your addiction was still working for you, maybe you would actually still be engaging in this addiction, because you call addiction a brilliant strategy. And in your book, you talk about how your addiction actually helped you survive for a time. It kept you alive. And so I also want to just validate for people watching who are struggling that these habits and addictions that we've created for ourselves came from strategies to survive. If there are days where if I don't have a drink, I might kill myself, obviously that's a more effective coping strategy than doing the other behavior. And even with all the training that clinicians receive in substance use, there is this unconscious bias that the use of substances, especially illegal substances, is due to some kind of character flaw or weakness. And I think part of that comes from way back in the AA days. They actually talk about that this is like a character flaw. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah. Wow. You said so much that I want to just
Sorry.
dive into. No, I loved it. I loved everything you were saying. I was right there with you. And there are so many layers to this. I think one thing that stands out, yes, absolutely. AA uses the term character defects. And I understand where that came from. And yet I think we're in a new era, right? And I really love the 12-step movement. And I think the 12-step movement has saved millions of lives. There's no doubt about it. And conscious recovery, like many other modalities, is another opportunity to add to that, not to replace it. It's so interesting the way the mind works, right? It's either this or it's that. And yet then we come to this conversation where we're saying, yeah, in conscious recovery, we call them brilliant strategies, which is really different than calling them character defects. So let's unpack that a little bit. I think we talked about this, I'm pretty sure last week, where we said shame doesn't heal shame. And shame is one of the root causes of addiction, as I've defined in conscious recovery: unresolved trauma, spiritual disconnection, and toxic shame. So we know that our clients, our patients, our friends, our loved ones, or ourselves are experiencing shame, and we feel broken. So if we feel broken, adding the term character defects to that, I don't see a lot of movement. What we want to start with is, in what way was it brilliant? And it's a really different framework, because in truth, it did save my life. There is no doubt that drugs and alcohol saved my life. I don't think that my psyche could have handled what I was living with, what I was feeling, what I was experiencing, and that those drugs and alcohol brought relief. I got sober young. So the issue with the strategy is, we're not saying it's brilliant, so keep doing it. We're saying, did it start as something that's brilliant? And, the way I like to say it is, we don't call it addiction if it's working, we call it fun. And so when the fun starts to be fun with problems, and then problems with a little fun, and then only problems, that's when most people say, oh, maybe I should do something about this. But there's a stigma, like you said. And I think even well-intending counselors, coaches, therapists have often been trained to diagnose and treat, which is important. But the issue with that is, when we're only diagnosing and treating, we might be, even if it's unconscious, looking through the lens of what's wrong with them and how do I help them fix that. And as soon as we're in that paradigm, there's an energy exchange that happens, and we're unconsciously adding shame to the shame that exists. So that's what I'm most passionate about. And when I go into treatment centers or therapy practices to train or have a workshop for clinicians, it really is this. That's the root of it. How am I viewing my client? What energy is connected to that, and what else is possible?
Beautiful. Thank you so much, TJ. And also, so shame really is at the root of addiction. And I believe there was a study done, I'm not sure how long ago, but it was with rats and cocaine, the use of cocaine.
Yes.
And so they created this amazing rat wonderland with all of the lovely stimulation, because rats are quite intelligent rodents and they need a lot of stimulation to thrive. And then they had the rats that were just in a cage with nothing to do. And the rats in the healthy rat environment that was designed for them to thrive in, there was cocaine in a water bottle, I think there, and then there was like fresh water. And so the rats in the Wonderland environment used the cocaine occasionally, but the rats in the invalidating environment, in the environment that was hopeless and offered them really nothing to help them thrive, those are the rats that started using the cocaine again and again and again and again, until the point when I'm guessing they often died, because they just needed more and more and more of that brilliant strategy to cope with the fact that the world that they lived in was not designed for them to thrive. So I'm curious to know how that, in your work experience and your personal experience, translates to the human experience.
Yeah, well, the story you're telling, the first time I heard it is in the incredible TED Talk, The Opposite of Addiction is Not Sobriety. I think it's called The Opposite of Addiction is Not Sobriety, it's connection. Because in part of that story is also that they had other rats. So in this lush environment, there were other rats. And in the cage, the isolated one was alone. So there are multiple layers to it, but it absolutely applies, because when we feel disconnected, and this usually happens early in life, when I disconnect from my true nature, if it's true I came in wide open and whole and perfect, and we talked a lot about that last time, I get programmed to believe I'm damaged or broken. And then a lot of times we isolate ourselves. We certainly separate from our true nature, but connection then becomes very difficult. We could talk about it through the lens of any kind of connection that is required, right? We can talk about it through the lens of an attachment disorder, which is a clinical way of saying we need love and connection when we come into the world. And if we don't get that, there's a wound that's developed. Or if we get it and then a traumatic event happens, like a parent dies, we move. You know, sometimes moving can be really traumatic for a young child, where they feel separate from, and there's an attachment wound. So simply said, we all need love and connection. And when we don't get that, there could be a wound that gets developed. We have these core false beliefs. We're walking around believing we're broken. Then we start to look outside of ourselves for love and connection, whether that's a relationship, cocaine, sex, shopping, gambling. Those things can bring relief. They can be brilliant. Then they can cross a line where, wow, they're not really bringing me the love and connection I thought they would, but I'm still doing them because I'm caught in that pattern. That is addiction in its simplest form, this incessant look outside and repetitively, engaging in something that was once brilliant, it really no longer is, but we either don't know how to stop it, we feel like we can't stop it, maybe even we don't want to stop it on some level, but that's really where we cross that line into addiction.
When we're trying to change any habit, that's no longer serving us, because obviously, I mean, habits, our brains are designed to create habits. Our brains are designed to automate so that we become more efficient, right? And so that habit forming ability is really, really useful. But if the habit that we have is no longer helpful, then we need to change it. But a lot of the times people come into treatment realizing, or forcibly being told that this habit is no longer serving you and you need to change it, but there isn't really a replacement. So if your entire social life revolves around using meth and staying up all night and having all these friends, like when you use substances, whether it's street drugs or alcohol, I mean, if you're in a new city and you want to make friends, the local pub is probably the easiest place to do that, right? Because people congregate around the things that the self-soothing tools that they use. So without that ability to make new connections around another shared experience, people are often like that. I feel like that makes recovery much harder, because now you've just left this gaping hole on so many levels in your life.
Yeah, and you're talking about the patterns, right? And the repetitive patterns. We understand now that we're creating new neural pathways in our brain. And a more common way to say it is the term stuck in a groove. That actually, I was told that actually came from the groove that we create in our brain. We don't think about how we brush our teeth. We just automatically do it because most of us have been doing it the same way for years. And so we're no longer even using the part of our brain that needs to create. It's just automatic. And so that is the same, that principle applies to the same thing of our other habits. So if we're in conscious recovery, I talk about the 4 rooms of existence, and it's an acronym PIES: physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. And a lot of what we're talking about right now is the physical. And when I mean physical, it's like what we can see, touch, and taste, right? The physical world. Yes, it's our physical body, but it's also, as you say, community, action. That's why when you get into 12-step programs, they say change your playmates and playpens. In other words, you're probably going to have to build a new community, right? And so in that room, that new habit is really important. That's why community is so vital in early recovery, because we want to replace that we could call unhealthy. I'm not a huge fan of that term, into something that's healthier. I would say useful or not useful, or is it supporting the person I want to become? The deeper work here, in addition to that, because that's very important, we want to start to look also at the habits of mind in the intellectual room, our habits of emotion. A lot of times that's running from them. That's the habit. I'm running from them. I'm numbing them out. I'm burying them. And then there's this spiritual room. And to me, I use that term. That might not work for everyone. If it doesn't work, we just talk about the deeper awareness of this trauma and shame and the disconnection that has happened. And how do we start to change the neural pathways? It's not only behavior, because what happens is this: a young child, for example, like I worked with a client who was born into an orphanage and was not held for a year. So this person had severe attachment wounds as an adult and was really wanting anyone to love him. And so he found himself in relationships that were abusive because he was desperately needing love. And so if we're only looking in the physical, we would talk about the patterns of that. And we might say, well, of course you're in this relationship because, that's all you know. And you don't want to, you desperately need this relationship. So you're not going to do anything to lose it. Something deeper is happening here. And that is, there's a shame core, there's an attachment wound, and there's some core decisions that this person made at a very, very young age. And the habit, if you will, or the brilliant strategy was, please love me, please love me. We call that anxious attachment. Oh my gosh, please love me, and then I'll be okay. And it most likely worked in some way in the beginning. And so the deeper awareness or the deeper work is starting to heal the actual underlying core false beliefs and the energy associated with that, healing those core wounds, because it's not just about choosing different relationships to create new neural pathways. Of course, that's important, but there's also this, which I hear a lot, and I certainly said, I know that, but I don't seem to be able to do it. And that's where the deeper work comes in. So it's not either or, it's both and. We look at all 4 rooms, and the deeper work of creating new neural pathways, which is exciting to me, is getting down and changing some of those core beliefs. And it actually changes our physiology. And this is like, we're living in really exciting times where we once thought DNA, genetics, the brain was solid. Now we realize wait a minute, we can actually change it. Some would say through behavior, and I would say yes, physically, intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually, we can start to change these things over time.
Yay. I feel like I need some pom-poms for
Yes,
that.
what a
Yes.
blessing, right?
Yeah, the idea that we can, not only change our neural pathways, which is so valuable, obviously, but that we can literally change the way our DNA reacts and responds, we'll just see where it takes us.
I've been told to be careful that I've been told to not say we change our DNA. I like the way you said it. We change the way it responds, right? We change, just like anything, right? I think we talked about this last time. It's not necessarily that the experience of the trauma will ever completely go away, but the way we relate to it changes. The way we work with it changes. The way it shows up in real time changes. And I think we're on the precipice of learning about genetics and DNA and the change that happens over time. For now, we're saying, wow, we can have a different relationship with that. Maybe it's not completely solid, which is one of the exciting conversations I love to be in around the disease model of addiction, the genetic model. A lot of times we hear we have a genetic predisposition, and I think that is quite possibly true. And in addition to that, that's not the whole story, because now we know that's not as solid as we once believed.
Well, and given how difficult life is for people and how long the human species has been around, I would imagine that every human has a genetic predisposition. Every mammal has a genetic predisposition. It's just how easily activated that DNA, those switches in our DNA are activated.
I love this because if we look at animals in the wild, for example, that instinct is an instinct for survival, and obviously it's important. And humans, if you look at the arc of human history, looking back, I mean, it wasn't long ago we were, killing each other in the town square for entertainment. It was really not long ago that we had slavery in this country. I mean, the Holocaust was very recently. Right. So we know that there are traumatic events that have happened in the world. Look at all the wars that have happened. That's not to say, oh my gosh, it's gloom and doom, but it's to say, let's take a look, because that is a very real part of the experience. What I think is really interesting in the individual, because we'll often think I have these experiences that are traumatic as an adult, and that's why I feel shame, or that's why I feel this pain. But we also want to look at the possibility that the trauma and the shame actually came first in a lot of ways, and we find ourselves putting ourselves in situations to cause more harm. It doesn't mean we're going to blame ourselves or blame the victim blaming. What we are saying is, when we start to heal this, we're going to start choosing things differently. And there is a possibility that we are in a time where we understand now that we can heal this generational trauma, and we can actually change the course of the planet, because we've been in reactivity. We've been at war, and we look at the politics in America, like all the divisiveness that people are wanting us to buy into once again. And there's a different possibility here. There's a different possibility that we can each heal not only our own trauma, but our generational trauma. I look at what my grandparents went through. They lived through the Depression. They lived through 2 world wars. They lived through the Depression. All of these things that happened that created their point of view that was passed down to my parents and passed down to me. And we can start to heal this. And there are some who have said, when we do our own healing, we heal 7 generations back. Now, that's fascinating to me, because we often hear we carry the wounds of 7 generations back. That's something we hear. And if that's true, if it's true that hurt people, healed people also heal people, and the only moment we can do it is right now, and the only person we can really heal is ourselves. And if each of us pause and start to do our own healing, there's a different emotional climate on planet Earth. We can actually have peace, but it always starts within.
God, thank you, TJ. That gives me so much hope for the future. And there are days when I have less of that. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
the reason that we agreed to get together today was to talk specifically about the work that I mean, I'm loving our conversation, but I want to make sure we capture this, because I'm sure there are some clinicians out there, or detox and rehabilitation workers, who are looking for this work, looking for how they can support their clients and themselves in really thriving instead of needing that addiction. How do you support these facilities in using the conscious recovery method?
So I'm going to start with the tangible, and then I'm going to talk about what the work is, because sometimes I forget the tangible. So I have a couple of different ways that people can access conscious recovery. One is on wholehearted.org. There's a conscious recovery for people in recovery course on there, and there's a conscious recovery for professional healers on there as well, where there's a deep dive. And so we're talking about clinicians now. So there's a course there that's a 10-hour course. You get 10 CEs, and it really dives into this idea of what it truly means to hold space, because we hear it often, but what does that actually mean, which we're going to talk about in a moment. The other thing is I can come in person into a treatment program and facilitate a one-day experience that I really call the Conscious Recovery Experiential Workshop, where we start to look at not just through our mind what it means to actually be present with someone, but we practice that with one another. I think we probably talked about the high levels of burnout in our last conversation, and we talked about, staff retention for really all companies, but specifically in behavioral health and addiction treatment. And so I come in and we create a safe space to start to look at our own healing that is required so that we can be more present. That's the tangible, and everything can be found on consciousrecovery.com. The essence of the work came from me starting in this field in 2008 or 2009 somewhere, and hearing well-meaning clinicians refer to their clients as their diagnosis, or labeling them as treatment resistant or drug seeking. And I think, we're working in addiction treatment and this person is 5 days sober. Of course they're drug seeking. That's why would we even label that, right? That's a given. That's why they're in treatment, right? I hear clients referred to as being entitled, unengaged or disengaged in group. So we have this idea somehow that we're here to diagnose and treat, which of course is important. If you're in the United States, you got to tell the insurance company exactly what you're diagnosing and treating. All of that is valid and a part of the recovery process. A lot of people stop there. What we're inviting with conscious recovery is, in addition to that, what is it like to actually hold a space? And what I mean by hold space is to see the person and their infinite intelligence and their infinite ability to heal. The paradox, of course, is they're coming to us at their most, in many cases, the most difficult moment of their life, the time they feel the most desperate. They probably do, or often do, feel broken, but we don't want to add to that by saying, yes, they are broken and it's my job to fix them. We want to start to encourage, and most of this is through energy, encourage them to get in touch with the part of them who wants to heal. There's always a part of me who wants to do the work of healing, and a part of me who wants to numb out or change the channel, or, not address it. That's all a normal part of the human experience. So how can we help a client begin to shift their awareness and reconnect with or re-experience the part of them that is whole and perfect, the part of them that is unharmable, and the part of them who wants to recover, who wants to be there? Once we start doing that, not only is it dramatically more effective, but it's so much easier for the clinician. When I started in the field, I worked at a 48-bed facility, and I remember going to work and thinking, if I thought I was going to fix 48 broken people, how exhausting would that be? But I would hear my coworkers refer to it that way. Well, we're here to fix people and save lives, and this work is difficult, and I have compassion fatigue. And my narrative was, I'm going, and I used to say, I'm going to work with the angels. And by the way, I didn't mean the staff, I meant the clients.
Oh,
right?
I know.
I know, we know, right? But it's really like that shift in their innate ability to heal and to be present and to actually address the underlying root causes. There's a part of them, even if it's a tiny little part, they want that. And of course, there's a part of them that wants to get up and run out of the room or use their brilliant strategy, whether that's anger or numbing out or causing a scene or fighting, all those things. When I can look beyond them, beyond the brilliant strategies, and look at the essence of the person. And I have a couple of really powerful stories I could share about how that actually happened in a tangible way. But our work can be energizing, and clients can start to reconnect with who they really are instead of connecting with the part of them that seems broken.
That's so beautiful. Thank you. And I feel the same way. I mean, my colleagues are amazing as well. It's interesting, when I started in this work, many of the population that I work with are street involved. So they've experienced homelessness and those types of things. And we see people on the street begging for change and really having a really difficult experience. And we have our biases against them, right? But every single person, I think there's that song by Amanda Marshall, everybody's got a story. And if you were able to take the time to get to know that person, you would find out that they have so much to offer. They have so much wisdom and love and experience that you could never imagine. And we just kind of write them off as we walk by.
Yeah, it's interesting as you're talking. I will tell one of the stories that I think speaks to this, and it's seemingly on the opposite end of the spectrum. So the treatment program I worked in was a very high-end, very expensive treatment program. And so there were a lot of people there that were extremely affluent. So it's sort of like the opposite end on the surface, the opposite end of the spectrum. But what's fascinating is you were talking about biases and judgment. I don't know if you use that word, but there's also, I noticed in particular with some members of the team that I worked with, they had biases and judgments about people who had a lot of money, saying things like, well, why do they, like, how can they have problems? They have an infinite amount of money, right? So it's very fascinating. So here's an example. So I was the spiritual director of a program in the Bay Area called Altamira. I absolutely love them. They're incredible. They do powerful work. And I was the person that they called in when someone was emotionally dysregulated. In other words, losing their blankety blank and, usually packing their bags and leaving treatment. And often I noticed that clients were labeled as entitled or treatment resistant at that point. So there was a young woman, and I say young, early 30s, and she was in the bougiest of the bougie room. So she had this beautiful room that overlooked San Francisco and the Bay and the big sunken bathtub. And right before lunch, about 10 minutes before lunch, one of the techs knocked on the door and said, "You need to move down to the room in the basement. You need to do it before lunch. Can you please pack your bags?"
Wow.
She had a huge reaction. And the way it showed up is, how dare you? This is my room. I'm paying all this money and I deserve to be here. And you can't just make me leave. And then she was like in a lot of anger. And so, of course, they called me in. And so when I went to meet with her, my mantra is two things when I'm going to meet with someone. She's a whole and perfect being. And what she's upset about is not what she's upset about. And I don't know what she's upset about, but let's figure this out. Let's sit together and find out what it is, because I don't know. I don't need to know, but if I'm curious, we're going to get to it. So we sat down. Of course, she was very angry. She was yelling and screaming and like, this place, they're not, no one sees me. And I just listened. And I listened. And I looked through all of that to the precious part of her. And at some point, she paused and broke down crying. And she said, "I was sexually abused in the basement of my home. I've never told anyone." And so when they told her, and it was a man who knocked on the door very forcefully, "Go to the basement right now," all of that got activated. But she wasn't in a place in her own evolution where she could say, "Oh, this is touching this, and this is what's going on." No, she was in reactivity. The key here is that if we would have just said, "Oh, go ahead and keep your room," or if we would have battled with her, which is what I see a lot of people do, or if we would have just tried to talk her into staying, which I wasn't doing, we would have had a very different result. And so at that moment, we got her, I called in her therapist, got her, to start working on this trauma. I think we brought in a trauma specialist at some point to help her, but that's really where her treatment began. And the reason I tell the story and the reason it's so important is, like I said, if we would have just said, oh, keep your room because it would be easier, or if we would have just said, well, she's just not ready for treatment, because we hear that all the time. She just must not be ready. Go ahead and go. Right? We would have missed the opportunity. And again, I would have never had any way of knowing that that's what was really happening. But I knew based on the massive reaction that there was something big that just got touched.
Oh my gosh, I feel like I need that tattooed to the inside of my eyeballs to remember, because we see this so often, and not even in substance use treatment or mental health treatment, but just out in the world. I mean, especially on social media, we see these extreme reactions, and I think it's normal or very common to assume, well, this person is just blankety blank off their rocker, not right. Like, what is wrong with this person? And we don't take the time to actually consider the thing that they're upset about is just the tip of the iceberg, right? Because as you were sharing, having to go from the bougiest of bougie rooms to the basement, I mean, on the surface, that sounds like a reasonable thing to be upset about.
Right, right. Which, by the way, the basement room was still very luxurious. Oh. But yes, it does seem like that. But I knew because of the magnitude of the response or the reaction that it was something else. I mean, someone can be upset about something like, oh, I thought, it's the food, it's the phone privilege, it's the I didn't get my laptop, it's the visitation hours changed, it's the, this facilitators, all of those things that happen in treatment where someone can get upset about. But when the reaction is really big, I think, oh, wow, this is such an opportunity, clinically speaking, because like she's really upset. So something just got touched. Let's use this as an opportunity to see if she can explore that. And that's really see, the thing about treatment is I think a lot of times we think of it as giving clients tools, but really it's helping them have an experience. Like, if I would have gone into kind of fix-it mode, like, here's a breathing technique when you're feeling activated. We would have probably called it triggered then. Here is a way. Why don't we take a walk to calm down? I wasn't telling her to calm down. We were like, yeah, let's be angry. Let's see what's here, right? I mean, obviously, we don't let people yell and scream at each other or, are physically violent, but I can hold it. I'm okay with her yelling and screaming because I knew that there was something there. I didn't know what it was. So I'm just going to be curious with her. And then she has the experience because that created safety. There's so many layers of what happened in that short interaction. And it was life-changing for me because I think it was at that moment that I realized, because I used to think things like, well, I don't really do anything. I just listen to people, but I'm realizing, no, that's actually not true. I'm doing a lot here in the not doing a lot here. And, I like to use this quote. It may sound like it has no way of relating to this, but I promise it does. Dolly Parton, I love this. She says, it takes a lot of money to look this cheap. I say, it takes a lot of work to look like I'm not doing anything, right? Because I have my own reactivity. I grew up with a mother who raged. So when someone was angry, I used to go into all my defense strategies, or I would become reactive, or I would disappear, I would numb out. And so being able to be present with someone's anger without being in reactivity or fixing it or checking out myself, numbing out myself, being truly present is engaged in that experience. And that actually takes a significant amount of work. But on the other side of it, the work is so much easier. It's the greatest paradox of our work.
Oh, that's so beautiful. And so I'm curious, as we've talked about habits, we've talked about rewiring our brain, because I think in the moment, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but how much active work does it feel like you're doing in the moment compared to this ability to be present and hold space is the accumulation of all of the work that you've done in the past to create those neural pathways in your brain?
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's always both and, right? When I first started doing this, it felt like a lot of work because it was just easier to tell someone what they should do. I thought it was easier, right? Like, I know what you need to do. You need to stop being so angry, right? We send people to anger management class, and instead of managing the anger, we want to ask, what is the anger managing? So in the beginning, it was a lot of work, but as I was doing my own process of healing, because the thing is, being present with clients is part of my own healing, because like I remember there was a group of clients at that same treatment program who were being overtly homophobic, and I had the opportunity to go sit down and talk with them, and it was so healing. But I noticed I was trembling inside because of my own trauma that I experienced with people, bullying me for being gay, right? So like, it was part of my healing. But on the other side of it, then it's like, wow, being present is so much easier and so much more effective. So I think ultimately, yes, it's easier to be present and hold space. But as you said, it requires that I do my own work. And sometimes that work is right in the moment. What am I experiencing? What am I experiencing? Not what is the client experiencing, right? I'm not making it about me externally, certainly, but like, oh, I notice I'm having a reaction. Let me tend to that so that I can be more present. And that, is something that I think in the beginning for me did seem difficult. And then it's like, wow, it's actually not. It's so much easier and so much more effective, because that's where the authentic connection comes in.
Is it okay if I ask you some questions about that conversation with the group of people with homophobia?
Oh my gosh, yes. It's
Okay.
my other favorite story to tell. And I will tell it, of course, not name names, but again, this was the bougie treatment center. But here's something that's fascinating. We were also in network, and this might sound technical to some people, we were in network with insurance companies as well. So we would have people that were paying private pay like $50,000 a month. And then we would have someone who was there on insurance and maybe doesn't have a lot of financial resources, which I thought was beautiful, right? Because we got to like be with people that maybe we wouldn't normally mix with, right? And so one of our primary referents at that time was a truck drivers union in New Jersey and Rhode Island, right? Now, I mean, picture it, right? And so like, there were these guys that came in, they were truck drivers, right? From New Jersey, and all, like the sweatpants and the gold chain, like this guy. I mean, I think about this guy, I adore him. So we had this client who came to treatment who had attempted suicide 72 hours earlier at a different treatment program. A gay man in his 40s who had never come out. A lot of shame. He was on a 72-hour hold, and he was released to our care so that he could address the issues of his own traumatic experience of being a gay man. So this was, 15 years ago. So a 40-year-old at that time would be basically my age. And, we grew up in a time where there was overt homophobia. He had religious trauma on top of it, right? So he comes to our care, wasn't going to come out to the milieu, but was talking with me and a couple other people about his journey, about accepting himself as a gay man. Okay, we've got the truck drivers and the bus drivers from New Jersey and Rhode Island. We've got this person, right, who had just attempted suicide. And then in comes this client who was gay. I mean, just like, he only wrote in purple glitter pen, and he was also a semi-public figure. He had been a personality on TV. So some people knew him, some people didn't. So I'm setting all of that. I'm setting the stage because here's what happened. The clients were going to an outside meeting, and they were in the van, which of course was an Escalade in our case. But the client who had attempted suicide was in the van, and a bunch of these guys from New Jersey and Rhode Island that were truck drivers, and they started saying overtly homophobic things about Glitter Pen, right? I call him Glitter Pen, who wasn't in the van. The person who was driving the van froze and didn't know what to do, didn't know how to address it. Obviously, no one knew the person in the van had attempted suicide and was deeply in the closet, and all of this was very much traumatizing him. So they get back to the treatment program, and people went nuts, right? Because the driver told the clinical team, the clinician, we called an emergency clinical meeting, and everyone in that room wanted to throw those clients out because that's hate speech. We don't tolerate that. That's abusive. We have to create a safe work environment or treatment environment. And Krista Gilbert, who was the CEO at the time, said, let's pause for a moment. What if there's a clinical opportunity here? Yes, their behavior is not acceptable. That's not debatable. We know that. But if we just throw them out, there might be a missed opportunity. Is everyone here willing to give me 48 hours with this? We're going to keep our clients safe. Everyone agreed. Of course, she's the CEO, so they're going to say yes, right? So she comes to me and says, will you go meet with these guys, right? Obviously, I'm not going to tell them about the client who had attempted suicide. But I went, that's when that moment when I realized there was still some things unresolved within me. And I went and sat and talked with these guys individually. And what happened was so miraculous. I think there were 4 of them, and 3 out of the 4 of them asked if they could come to the LGBT group, which I facilitated, to apologize and learn. And I went back to that group and they said, yes, we'd love to have these guys come. They come to the group, tears. One of them opened up and said, you know, my younger brother is gay and I tormented him and I don't know how I can ever heal that. So the gay clients were helping him, like, you might do this. What if you did this? So there was this miraculous healing that took place. And then when those guys, when Glitterpin graduated, I'll call him that, those guys, the truck drivers, made a huge card and wrote only in Glitterpin, to our first gay friend, we love you. And so the layers of healing that took place because Krista had the understanding that if we just throw them out, we're going to miss an opportunity, became one of the most pivotal moments in my life, because I realized the healing that could transpire. Now, the client who had attempted suicide, he never did come out to the other group of people, but he witnessed all of that. He witnessed these people coming around and realizing that they had caused harm and trying to make it right. He was able to be present with that and see the healing that took place. And it was also very much a healing experience for him.
Thank you so much for sharing that, TJ. I'm curious, the question I wanted to ask you is, when you were working with these folks and your own stuff was coming up, did you self-disclose any of that to them, or how did you approach that from recognizing your own activation on this subject?
So are you asking if I disclosed with them the process that I was in, that this was hard for me to talk with them?
I'm not sure. I'm just wondering, because I know that in a lot of clinicians are trained not to self-disclose at all, ever. But the evidence is showing that there is a therapeutic advantage to certain types of self-disclosure, obviously not to get it off your own chest, right? But as a way to connect with the clients and help them understand a different perspective. So I'm just wondering if you did self-disclose in any way, what did that look like?
Well, it's interesting, because part of the conscious recovery experience, when I go into treatment programs and train clinicians, we talk about what percentage of communication is verbal and nonverbal. And we realize that only 10% to 15% of communication is verbal. So when we think about self-disclosing, we think that might be verbally, but the truth is it's more energy. It's really more energetic, right? So they might be aware of what I'm experiencing. I mean, obviously I was very much an out gay man that I've never had the ability to really be in. I was also facilitating the LGBT group. So that part was definitely in the open. And when I went and shared with them, I think they might have picked up that it was uncomfortable for me. I didn't name that, but it was at that moment that I realized that bringing my humanity into it, not verbally, but energetically, was very healing. I do remember the sensation that I had of noticing my own, I guess, nervousness, or really activation, kind of a trauma response, being present with that, with myself, with them. I think actually created a really safe space. And maybe, I don't know this to be true, but maybe they were even able to see how that impacted me, their words and their behavior and their actions. And, you know, it's so easy to go into judgment. These guys shouldn't have that. But to hear them say, my first gay friend, right? That's so telling. And so I think it's being present, and again, being present with what I'm experiencing. I'm not necessarily telling them that, but I think sometimes another layer to that self-disclosure piece is a lot of times clinicians are trained that we don't talk about our own experience in the room. And I think that's even more powerful than self-disclosure. It's a form of self-disclosure. And if a client, for example, I know you and I have sat in front of clients and they're telling a horrific story, but they're smiling, right? And they're not able yet to access the emotions, or their strategy of not being connected with the story and the emotion is such a lifelong strategy that they're not even aware they're doing it. So one thing I will do is say, can we pause for a moment? I notice I'm feeling sad, and I would appreciate if I could just have a moment to sit with it. Because what I'm doing is I'm modeling for them what it's like to just take a moment and feel. I'm not saying your story is making me sad, or I'm definitely not saying I notice you're smiling when you're telling this horrific story, which a lot of people I know do. I would never do that. I would say, I notice I'm feeling sad right now. Would it be okay if we sit with it for just a moment? Okay, thank you. What are you noticing right now? And see if they can say, I don't know, I'm not noticing anything. Oh, what might that be about? Then we can start to inquire, or is there something you're noticing in your body right now? And so, modeling that and speaking to it and holding a little space for myself, we have to do it very delicately, but I think it can be really powerful.
Thank you for sharing that, TJ. And that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I've noticed and I don't always remember to do this because when you've got a zillion other things going on and you're trying to support someone in that moment, we are only human, and we get better as we practice, right? Yes. And as we have more of these discussions. But I really love that, sharing what you're experiencing in the moment in that room in real time as a modeling opportunity, and also bringing it back to those truckers. I can imagine that when they've said those things to other people, or when we behave in a way that is hurtful, and sometimes a lot of the time when we behave in ways that are hurtful, it's intentional, right? We're trying to hurt that person either the way they hurt us, or as a way to project the hurt that we're feeling inside. And I might not be consciously intentional, but it's down there, right? And the fact that you were able to have the experience and self-disclose energetically what was going on, but still hold the space and not react to it, right? Like when we, bringing it back to social media and the political polarization right now, what happens is that one group will say, well, I disagree with this group, but they're not just saying I disagree with the values and here's why. It's y'all are a bunch of idiots and you're defective and stupid and horrible, evil people.
Right.
And then of course that other person, now they have the choice where they could take that in and respond more compassionately, but they haven't done the work. So then they react, and then it goes back and forth and feeds into itself. So when we are able to learn how to do that, either as clinicians or just as people out in the world, whoever is watching this,
exactly,
being able to take that in and be like, wow, like what you said really hurt me. That was really hurtful. But to not react and then throw back and insult and escalate the situation, that in itself is a teaching moment.
Well, and that's how we change the emotional landscape of the planet, right? And what we're not saying is, because people will say, well, then I'm just going to be a doormat, or I'm just going to agree with them. No, that's not at all what we're saying. What we're saying is, and I'll put it in the I, but what I'm saying is, and what I think I heard you say is, when I tend to my reaction rather than what just was just said, and even if I pause, I mean, can you imagine if the whole world would just pause for 5 seconds and feel what's present? Because, when we teach someone about anger management, we say, count to 10. But we very rarely say, what do you do when you're counting to 10? Because counting to 10 in itself is not going to change anything. It might cause a little bit of an interruption, but it doesn't tend to what's actually happening. And so I remember working with the client who had anger issues, right? And I don't see anger as an issue. I see it as a strategy. And I'm curious how it was once brilliant and how it's not now. And I remember the first time we got to a place where I said, what do you think the anger is masking or managing? He started crying. And, you know, of course, you and I probably think that's, of course, people have asked him that. He said, no one's ever asked me that. He was 27 years old. No one had ever asked him. Right. So being able to, yes, the count to 10, yes, the pause, but what are we doing during that pause? We're noticing what we're experiencing. What am I experiencing without the story? Because the story is they're wrong. They shouldn't say that. They shouldn't be alive. No, you know, we don't say that, but we kind of do. I mean, I look at people, let's just say politically, people I've known for many, many years, and they're like, there's this one person and he's evil. And once he's not in office, then I'll be free. And then they celebrate when the person dies. I remember just seeing like, oh, ding dong, the witch is dead. I'm like, oh my gosh. But now there's someone else to be angry at. And now there's someone else to be angry at. And what I'm not saying is we have to agree with them. It's kind of like when we're healing something as serious as sexual trauma, we're not making what happened okay. We're realizing that what we want to tend to is our reactivity, because the greatest freedom that we can experience is freedom from the reactive impulse. And when I'm free from the reactive impulse and I'm tending to what's happening here, not only do I respond differently, but it starts to change things. And I don't know if I told the story about LA and Lower Alabama on our last conversation, but that's a funny story. But I think what's happening in the world, we can apply it to this.
I'm trying to remember. Do you want to tell the story, even if it's repeating?
Sure, it might be repeating. So my dad and his wife live in LA, Lower Alabama. They call it LA, and apparently that's a thing there. We live in LA. And of course, I live in the other LA, California, and they came to visit recently. This was in November of last year. And my stepmother was like, people are so nice here. This isn't what I was told people were going to be like in LA. And so I asked her about that, and she said, well, you know, people back where I'm from, Lower Alabama, they say all these things about LA people being snobby, LA people being rude, LA people being self-centered, all the stereotypes. And I said, you know, I bet if we walked around LA, California with a microphone and asked 20 people, what do you think about people from Lower Alabama? We might hear some judgment too. So it's like, it's happening in both directions. Maybe some of it is true, but is it really the truth? Or is it these stories that we create? And it becomes like we try to find people who agree with us. We call those political parties or religions, support groups. We come together to agree with something, and there's a benefit to that, but there's a big shadow side. And that big shadow side is, if you don't agree with us, then you're the other. And the other is what has created every war and every traumatic event on planet Earth, every single time. In the most extreme, the Holocaust, wars, we see that over and over and over again. And so I don't think we live in a polarized country. I think we've been conditioned to have polarized thinking. And so when I understand that my biases are creating separation, and curiosity might create more connection. If I go to Lower Alabama, there are probably going to be people on the surface that don't even want to talk to me. They might not even want to talk to me. But if I'm willing to actually sit with them and hear them, and we have a conversation, we might discover that what we all want is the same. You know, I think about the number one thing that there was a survey done of Americans, of people in the United States, and the number one thing people wanted was security. And for some, security was, let's build a wall and don't let anyone in. For others, it's let's tear the wall down and be more open and loving. We have a different strategy or idea, but at the core of it, at the root of it, what we all want is love and connection. If we could start to have a conversation about that, imagine the healing that can happen. And then, you know, we have media outlets that propagate they get ratings from that, and on and on and on, right?
Oh, thank you for sharing that, TJ. And I don't think you told that story,
Okay.
I am sometimes forgetful. So, but I love that. And when you said, oh, the people in lower Alabama, LA, say that LA people are so rude
Right.
and snobby. And if you're looking for that, you will
You find
find it for
That's right.
sure. Right.
Absolutely.
But the same could be true. I'm sure there's people in lower Alabama who are also rude
Right.
and snobby, right? All of us as humans, we really have these same core needs, all living things. We have different strategies to attempt to get those needs met.
Right.
And when we can look beyond the surface of, I disagree with your strategy to getting this need met, and looking deeper at what is the need?
Yeah.
What do you need and what do I need? And how can we co-create that together? I love the word you used last time, co-curious.
Yes, I've been using that since our show. It's amazing. Yeah, it's interesting because I think about our animalistic self, right? My husband and I have been watching a lot of nature shows this week. And, the innate sense of protecting my own is survival in the animal kingdom, straight up survival. And they need that, at least at this level of evolution, right? And a mother must protect its baby from the eagle that could come down and get it, right? There's these things that that's the other, and the other is unsafe. And it's true. And it could be debated that it's true in humanity as well. And the question I ask is, are we ready to move beyond only our animalistic instinct and our animalistic reality? Because if you look back on planet Earth, humans have pretty much still been animals, because we've been at war. We've been having these political divides. We've been fighting for different countries. All of these things that happen, the borders that we create. And some people will say that's very Pollyanna to think we could move beyond that, or we are animals. Why would we move beyond that? And what I want to ask is, what does it create when we only live there, right? I'm not saying, just leave your door unlocked and everything's going to be fine. But the healing that can transpire over the course of time, as more and more of us start to heal, we start to realize that we are more than just animals. And if we don't acknowledge that, we're going to continue to have that animalistic experience, right? And you named it. I see what I expect to see. We call it confirmation bias now. Quantum mechanics is showing us now that it will produce a result it's more likely to produce this result we're looking for. So there's a story of someone who goes to a new town and says, tell me about your town. What are the people like here? And the person says, well, tell me about the place you just left. And the person says, well, it's a beautiful place. There's loving, kind people and so much connection. And I just feel so much love in my community. And the person said, oh, that's exactly what you'll experience here. That's exactly how our town is. And then the next person comes and says, I just moved to your town. Tell me about it. Well, tell me about where you lived. Oh, it's horrible. I had to get out of there. Everyone's rude and mean, and the traffic and people shooting each other. It's a horrible experience. Well, that's just like our town. You're going to find that here, right? Yeah. And that's such a simple, and people, the mind is a trickster, because they're going to be like, are you trying to tell me that just because I'm only looking for love, all this other stuff's going to stop happening? Actually, yes, over time. It might not happen instantly, but it happens individually, and it can happen collectively.
PJ, I want to be mindful of your time, but I feel like this conversation isn't quite complete. Do you need to have a few more minutes, or you have to go?
I have a few more minutes. Absolutely.
Okay, perfect. You were saying how this tribalistic view and the protective and the survival, yes, those things are necessary to a degree, but our world is so much more complex than that. So if we look at cities, if we look at organizations, companies, groups of people, congregations, sport teams, we do need to meet those survival needs. But as we can see with all that's happening on our planet, if we only focus on that level and we don't discern and prioritize and make account for these other needs, right? If we only focus on these base survival needs, ultimately it results in our demise, right? We continue to suck the resources out of the planet and not put anything back into it. And then eventually the species dies off, or the planet dies off. So we need to start being co-curious about how humanity can work together, because we do have tribes of communities, right? And it is important to have a connection of a smaller group of people, right? But as a species, we are also all connected, and we need to be able to survive together as a species. And then we also need to take a broader look at, it's not just our species, because we are interconnected and interrelated with every other species and resource and bacteria and all of the things on the planet. And the microcosm is the macrocosm. We need to take into account more than just our tribe, our family, our species, we have to build out and out and out. And it kind of reminds me of that loving kindness, the meta meditation, right? Where we give loving kindness to ourselves, we give loving kindness to someone who's very close to us, and it branches out and out and out and out and out until it expands basically to the whole world, or even further than that. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of touch on that and get your opinion on how collectively we can start, and individually we can start working towards more of that.
Yeah, and I love what you're saying, right? Because what we're not saying is don't have a tribe. What I'm saying is we're more than just that. So we honor that, right? Whether it's race or age or sexual orientation or socioeconomic status, we tend to find people that are similar to us. What happens though often is we use the term like-minded people. So we try to find groups who agree with us, which can be really comforting, but it can also be a trap, because as soon as we're saying we want like-minded people, then we're going to automatically other someone, right? Or if I'm saying, well, I live in a blue state, so the red state is automatically different, which isn't even true, right? And there are so many different factors to what makes a human, but what we're saying, or what I'm saying, is we honor and respect that, and at the same time realize we're more than that, right? So we don't dishonor that. It's not about like no longer doing that or there's something wrong with that. What I'm saying though is, like, we have groups of people who come together, who are, say, I have a tribe of like-minded people, and then we say we're right and they're wrong because we believe this. And the issues with that are just so layered. One issue in its simplest form is, then we have to start agreeing with everyone. There was that famous study done, I think in the 1960s, where they lined up like 6 people and they had a very simple equation, like 3 times 8. And then everyone in the line was in on the experiment except for the last person, and everyone gave the same wrong answer. And by the time they got to the one person who was unaware that it was an experiment, they actually gave the wrong answer. That right there, I think, tells it all. And I'm not saying that one group is perpetuating lies and everyone's starting to agree with it. It's that when we come together with a group of people and our very survival depends upon that connection, we have to start to agree with them if we're only basing that community in thought, belief, opinions. If we're saying, oh, if I say I disagree with that, I might be out of the group. And if I'm out of the group, I won't survive. It's very instinctual for us. So we end up thinking, oh, how do we all think about this? What do we all feel about this? And that's where the shadow side of it comes in. So, you know, if you're part of a spiritual community or religion that's teaching that you're against something, I would take a look at that. If you're part of a political organization that is only about fighting something instead of standing for something, I would look at that, right? How are the ways that we can connect? It doesn't mean I'm not going to have my opinions, but there's something much deeper than that here. We're talking about a deeper experience than just my thoughts and opinions. I hope that answered your question.
No, that's beautiful. And I'm just wondering, that is just very telling about our human nature. And I know also in healthcare, there have been studies done, and when there's incidents that have happened of people dying on the operating table and things like that, I can't remember what book I read it in, but there were times when the power structure, when the doctor has all of this power, and it's a culture of you never disagree with the doctor, or you're shamed or you're fired or anything, right? And what happens is that the nurses and the assistants and all of that in the operating room, they notice the doctor's made a mistake, but
Yeah.
there isn't the safety to say, hey, actually, you're cutting off the wrong leg or whatever, right? And then we end up with those types of situations. The patient dies, they get the opposite treatment because the cultural structure was set up in such a way that it wasn't safe to do that. And so I'm kind of feeling like, I consider myself a liberal minded person, but I don't call myself a liberal anymore because I don't fit with that community. And I've noticed there's some internet personalities who they were very liberal minded, and actually in order, because they didn't fit with that community anymore, rather than being a lone wolf out there or feeling like that, because I think that the two opposite sides are the most vocal, but there's other people who live in that middle path. So the internet personality I'm thinking about has actually gone from liberal to extremely conservative. Now they're saying, oh, Christianity is the way to go. And they're also, I noticed they're thinking that all Christians are like this. And it's like, I know Christians who are liberal. There are plenty of Christians who are liberal. It goes from, well, this isn't my tribe, so now I've got to conform myself and delude myself into thinking that now I have completely opposite views. How do we, because we obviously as humans need some of that safe space. We need a tribe. So how do we, maybe it might mean that we need to minimize our tribe. I don't know what advice you have, but I feel like we need to create a culture, whether that's a small friendship culture, business culture, planetary culture, where it is safe to disagree. It is safe to say, I actually have concerns. Like, I hear what you're saying, and here's the concern I'm having. And just being able to discuss it and understanding the root and the core need of where this viewpoint is coming from. Because then often what happens is that we're able to slightly shift both views. Yeah. I don't know.
And I think the important thing here for me is to realize, what am I wanting to build a community around? Am I wanting to build a community around a philosophy or an idea? Or am I wanting to build a community around true safety and connection? True safety and connection, I think of my good friend, like, we could not be more in disagreement about a hot topic on planet Earth right now. And it's a big one. We're on opposite ends of the spectrum, but it's not about me compromising my opinion on that. It's that we have a heart connection. We've created a very safe friendship that is beyond all of that. And so I'm not trying to change him. I can hold where I'm at and not making him wrong about it. I do have some big feelings around it, because it's about very survival of innocent people in my mind. But when we come together and we build a community around deep connection, authentic connection, then it's not really about a concept or an ideology. And when we move beyond that, then we can start to have more nuanced conversations, and then we can start to actually hear someone instead of being in our reactivity. It goes back to that, right? Am I reacting and responding and you're wrong and let me tell you why? Or like, oh, that's an interesting point of view. And so, judgment constricts and curiosity opens. So we're going back, I guess we're closing the way with co-curious. Let's be curious about this together. Let's be curious about where you learned this. What were the programs you received? I mean, people have deep programs around race and sexual orientation and religion. Sometimes they have just accepted it without questioning it. So if I'm willing to question mine with them, they might be willing to question theirs. And then we realize there's a place where we can actually connect, that this isn't about looking for how we can divide each other. And again, it actually happens internally and gets projected outward. I used to be terrified of people who didn't agree with me. I was scared of them. I had some deep wounds, and I thought, they're wrong, and I'm going to march on the streets and fight for what I think is right. And then I realized at some point, I understood my anger. I understood my desire to be right and to make another person wrong. And I also realized that a lot of it was my unhealed trauma and my own fear of being present with someone who I might have a judgment about. I might have to look at that. So to me, it's really about building a community of either like-hearted or like being. You know, if we're connecting from a level of being instead of just our thinking minds, I think we start to create a very different kind of community.
Oh, thank you. And I just want to ask a clarifying question. My guess is you're not saying we don't still march in the street, because that can be impactful.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting you say that, because in my first book, Conscious Being, I talk about spiritual activism, and I talk about what level of consciousness I bring to my activism, because a lot of times when we think of activism, we think about what we're against, and that's a certain level of consciousness that creates more of that. In my experience, it has a place, but I question how effective it is. Or maybe I go into it thinking these poor people, I'm here to help them. There's that level of consciousness that people can bring to their social, like, justice activities, like these poor, deprived, disenfranchised people. I'm so privileged and I'm here to help them. That creates this. When I'm like, we're equal here. I am here to do my own work. I'm here to stand for something, not against something. Once I start standing for and standing in my truth instead of standing against yours, things change. And I think that's where the social justice movements of like Martin Luther King or Gandhi, the ones that have made such a profound impact on planet Earth, have come from what I'm standing for, not what I'm standing against. It doesn't mean we don't speak to what we see. That's where the mind is like, oh, I'm just going to lay down and be a doormat. Not at all. I'm going to speak to if I see something that seems like injustice, but not from a place of like, these people are evil because they're doing this. Let's come from a different level of consciousness, stand for equality, stand for oneness, stand for honoring different people, stand for empowering people to change their situation if they want to. That is what creates real change, not this constant fight and making another group wrong. I hope that was clarifying.
No, so much. And I know, like Brene Brown has shared, the activism, it is needed, right? We want to be conscious activists, and she shares a story of where she used a term that she didn't know had racial undertones. No idea, right? And the person who heard it came up, and rather than saying, hey, I don't know if you're actually aware, but that word you used is actually racist. And then she would have been like, oh my gosh, right? But the person came at her of like, you're a piece of crap, and what a hypocrite, because you teach all this love and everything, and you're racist. And that wasn't what happened. And I think it's so easy for us, whatever it is that we're fighting for or against, that is the reactive, you said that about my group, or you said that about a group of people I feel needs my support. How dare you? You're a piece of crap. And that's I think there's a movement now, the calling out, right? That's calling out versus calling in, like, hey, what's going on? Like, I'm noticing this, and how can we understand it and soften it?
Beautiful. Absolutely.
Yeah. TJ, I know, thank you so much for sharing more of your time. I know that you are building your platform, and that you're out there all over the internet, and your books and everything. And I just want to say, I hope that your sphere of influence, that you just get more and more known and famous, because the work that you are doing and the way that you share it and present it is just so powerful and meaningful. And the world needs more of TJ Woodward. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
For your time.
That. I'm so grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. And if you are watching this discussion, please share it. Let's get this message out. If any of this resonates with you, don't just take it in and be like, yeah, I agree with that. That was wonderful. Share it. Let it be known, because the more we can create more of this. What was the name that you used for that? Like being?
Yeah, like being, or like-hearted. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. And TJ, is there anything else you want to say before we close the show?
I always like to close with this. If for anyone watching or listening right now, if no one has told you today, you are a whole and perfect being, regardless of what has happened, regardless of what you've done, you are worthy of love and connection. And the truth is, you are love.
Beautifully said. Thank you to TJ Woodward, tjwoodward.com and wholehearted.org if you want more information on the conscious recovery teaching method. And thank you so much for being with us today. Sending you lots of love. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. Make sure to subscribe and check out one of these lovely videos. Thanks for being part of this community, and we'll see you next time.